Good evening. How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Tuesday, Yom Shlishi. Let's light up the darkness with a new wisdom candle. We've gone through a lot of candles together. This is our 1,515th page, our 1,515th daf together. And that's a lot of wisdom candles. It's such a blessing to be learning with you every day, my holy sisters and brothers. Very colorful daf today. This story of Rav Kahana and Rabbi Yochanan. A little bit reminiscent of Rabbah and Rabbi Zera. See if you remember that story from Tractate Megillah when we get to it momentarily. Who's in the house? Stephen in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Bill in mid-Missouri, Lucy in Minnesota, Melissa in Great Neck, Bella in Florida, Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Jonathan drying in Southern California. Yeah, it's been a lot of rain for us. Thank God, thank God. Joseph in Massachusetts, Karen in Northern California, Sharon is with Sai, the Talmud cat. Paula in the Great Northwest, Marjorie in Georgia, Aoife in Florida, Florence in New York City. Welcome, everybody. I want to give a big thank you to everybody. We are a nonprofit. Accidental Talmudist is a 501c3, and so big thanks to everyone who is supporting our nonprofit. It costs money to create content every day. Webmaster, web design, digital design, visual design. The app has cost a fortune. I mean, it's just cost a lot to create an app. It's almost ready. We're really just on the cusp of launching it. Very excited about that. But, between teaching the class, post-production on the movie, creating all the content, fundraising has not been easy for us. So people who are donating, thank you so much. If you've thought about donating, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. I'm sure Nina will put the link in the comments. But very simple, donate.accidentaltalmudist.org. The recurring donation, the monthly donation, $18, amazing. $36, amazing. $10, amazing. $7, amazing. Whatever works for you. It's just great to be involved when you donate to Accidental Talmudist. I mean, you talk about bang for your tzedakah dollar. We just put out so much content for so many people around the world learning Torah with us. We never charge for content. Like the Wikipedia solicitations you always receive. It's a very small percentage of the people who consume the content that ever donate. So if you would think about stepping up and becoming a recurring donor at donate.accidentaltalmudist.org, it would be wonderful for our organization. Okay. Our daf today is page 117 here in Tractate Bava Kamma, the 21st volume of the Talmud. We're approaching the very end of this tractate. Thursday is the siyum. So bring something to have a l'chaim, make a drink, make a toast. And then Friday, we start Tractate Bava Metzia, which is a traditional starting point for learning Talmud for young people. So if you know someone who's thinking about doing it, or if you've been sort of auditing the class and thinking about committing, Friday, amazing day to start. Okay, we're continuing our discussion of Mishna number 6 here in chapter 10. Which basically said that if somebody robs a field, right, so takes possession of somebody's field, and he's a robber, right? The owner knows who took the field, and he's just not strong enough to do something about it. But then the robber is displaced by bigger thugs than the robber. So in this case, one Jew, bullies his way into another Jew's field. And then the Persians or the Greeks or the Romans or any one of the, the many armies of invasion that have taken over Jewish land over the millennia steps in and takes it from the robber. So the Mishnah made a distinction that if the marauding army called thugs were going to take land from everybody in the region, well, then what the robber did was meaningless because they would have taken it from the original owner the same way they took it from the robber. But if a smaller number of thugs came and they took the land from the robber, and that's all that, they didn't take the surrounding fields, they just took the robber's field, they chose him to be their victim, well, then the robber still has to make good for what he stole from the original owner. So we continue this discussion near the bottom of page 116b. The Mishnah teaches if the thugs took the field due to the robber, meaning specifically from the robber, not just from everybody, the robber is obligated to provide the owner with a different field. And the Gemara asks, what are the circumstances of the case in this latter clause of our Mishnah? If we say that they seized only his land, i.e. the robber's land, and did not seize all the other lands in the region, well, you already learned this from the first clause of the Mishnah, because it said if it is a regional disaster in which the thugs seize all the property in the region, then the robber is not obligated to compensate the owner of the field, which indicates that if it is not a regional disaster, the robber is not exempt from payment. So what novelty does the latter clause of our Mishnah teach? And the Gemara explains, no, it was necessary to state this for a case where the individual did not actually take control of the property before it was seized by the thugs, but rather showed the field to the thugs and thereby facilitated their occupation of the field. A different version of this answer is as follows. With what are we dealing here? A case where Gentiles coerced someone and told him to show them his land for them to seize. And he showed them that field belonging to his neighbor, along with his own fields, and the thugs then seized all the land that he showed them. Right? So whether we have a guy, a Jew who's in fear of his life, or maybe a Jew who thinks he can escape having his stuff seized by offering up, his neighbor's land instead, or some kind of jackass who, his stuff is getting stolen. He's like, well, if I have to suffer, my neighbor should suffer too. I mean, words like collaborator and capo come to mind. Now, if he's simply being coerced at the threat of his life, well, then those words are inappropriate. But if he's some kind of informant / collaborator / capo, betraying his people, his neighbors, his tribe, in order to curry favor, with these marauders, well, as you'll see, our sages do not view this person very favorably at all. Now, the Gemara recounts a related incident. There was a certain man who showed piles of wheat belonging to the exilarch's household. The exilarch was the head of the Jewish community in Bava, known as the Reish Galusa, belonging to the exilarch's household, and he showed it to thugs who seized them. So the case came before Rav Nachman for judgment, and Rav Nachman deemed the man liable to pay the exilarch for the stolen wheat. Rav Yosef was sitting behind Rav Huna bar Chiya, and Rav Huna bar Chiya was sitting before Rav Nachman. And Rav Huna bar Chiya said to Rav Nachman, did you deem him liable to pay because that is the law, or was it a fine? And Rav Nachman said to him, this individual's liability is written explicitly in the Mishnah, i.e. it is the law. As we learned in the Mishnah, if thugs took the field due to the robber, he is obligated to provide the owner with a different field. And it was established that the Mishnah is referring to a case where an individual showed the field to thugs who later seized it. Well, so too in this case. The one who showed the exilarch's wheat pile to the thugs is obligated to pay for them. After Rav Nachman left, Rav Yosef said to Rav Huna bar Chiya, what difference does it make to you if it is the halacha, the law, or if it is a fine? And Rav Huna bar Chiya said to him, if it is the halacha, we learn from it and apply this ruling to other cases. But if it is a fine, we do not learn from it, as it is possible that Rav Nachman had a specific reason to impose a fine in this case that involved the exilarch, and that involved perhaps some kind of collaborator who has a history of being a collaborator, right? And we're not going to necessarily extend the judgment in this case to other cases as a precedent. That's the difference. We are on 117a now. And the Gemara asks, and from where do you say that we do not learn from the imposition of a fine in one case and apply the ruling in other cases? And the Gemara answers that the source is, as it is taught in a Baraisa, initially the sages would say that one who renders another person's food ritually impure, tameh, thereby rendering it unfit for him to consume, unfit for a priest to consume, and one who pours another's wine as a libation for idol worship, thereby rendering it an item from which deriving benefit is prohibited for all Jews. These people are liable to pay the owner for the financial loss they caused, despite the fact that damage is not evident, right? When you render something tameh, it looks just the same. It's only because you know that the circumstances, what the circumstances were that led it to become tameh. So now it cannot be used as terumah to give to a priest, for example. Or if wine was used, some of it to pour as a libation for idolatry, right? So now that wine becomes forbidden for use for all Jews because it was something that was used for avodah zarah, for idolatry. So subsequently, they added to this list to say that even one who intermingles terumah, the portion of the produce designated for the priest, with another person's non-sacred produce, thereby rendering the non-sacred food forbidden to non-priests, is liable to compensate the owner for the loss of value of the produce, as fewer people will be willing to buy it from him. And the Gemara comments, so it may be inferred from the Baraisa that it is only because the sages subsequently added to the list that yes, one who intermingles terumah with another's non-sacred produce must compensate him. But if they had not subsequently added to the list, he would not be liable. And what is the reason that we do not learn that he is liable from the cases of one who renders another's food impure, or one who pours wine as a libation for idol worship? As this is also a case in which one causes damage that is not evident. Is it not due to the fact that his payment was a fine? And with regard to a fine, we do not learn from one case that it may be imposed in other circumstances. So we're seeing the sages being very careful about when we can establish a precedent based on a judgment in one rabbinic court. Are we going to extend that to other cases in other courts? Sometimes yes, sometimes no, but they're going to be very careful about, does this have the power of precedent? So the Gemara answers, no, this is not the reason that we don't extend it that way. Rather, initially, the sages maintained that they were concerned with regard to a large financial loss. For example, the cases of one who renders another's food impure or pours his wine as libation for idol worship. But with regard to a small financial loss, for example, one who intermingles terumah with another person's non-sacred produce, they were not concerned. They didn't need to make a decree for that situation. And ultimately, the sages maintained that they were concerned with regard even to a small loss as well and imposed the liability. So they extended the liability to that kind of case when they made a decree in order to do so. We couldn't just learn it out from the one time they did it. So the Gemara asks, is that so? But didn't the father of Rabbi Avin teach the Baraisa as follows? Initially, they would say that one who renders another's produce impure and one who intermingles terumah with another's non-sacred produce are both liable to pay for the financial loss that they caused, despite the fact that the damage is not visibly evident. So subsequently, they added to this list to say that even one who pours another's wine as libation for idol worship is also liable to pay a fine for the loss that he caused. And it may be inferred that it is only because the sages subsequently added to the list that yes, one who pours the libation is liable. But if they had not subsequently added to the list, meaning issued a decree, then he would not be liable. In other words, we can't learn it out just from the precedent. So the Gemara comments, since one who offers libations for idol worship causes a large financial loss, the rationale offered previously cannot apply to this version of the Baraisa. Accordingly, what is the reason that the liability for pouring another's wine as libation could not be extrapolated from the fine that was imposed for rendering another person's food impure or intermingling it with terumah? Is it not due to the fact that we do not learn from the imposition of a fine in one case that a fine may be imposed in other cases? And the Gemara answers, no. That is not the reason. Rather, the reason is that initially the sages held in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Avin, and ultimately they held in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah. And the Gemara elaborates. Initially, they held in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Avin, as Rabbi Avin says, if one stood in the public domain on Shabbos and he shot an arrow from the beginning of an area measuring 4 cubits to the end of an area measuring 4 cubits, and the arrow tore another person's silks in the course of its travel through the air, then the one who shot it is exempt from paying for the cloth. A case so bizarre, it obviously never happened in real life, but they're examining a legal principle, right? So what's happening is somebody's shooting an arrow, right, from one place to another place, perhaps from one private domain to another private domain. It's going to fly through the air in between, and while it's traveling through the air in between, it's going to cause damage to a third party's silks, right? It's going to tear some silk. So the question is, who's liable and for what? Now, the reason that this one who shot the arrow is exempt is that lifting an item is a necessity for placing it elsewhere. And therefore, the entire process from when one shoots the arrow until it comes to rest is considered to be a single act. And the one performing it is liable to receive the death penalty for violating on Shabbos, right? He shot it on Shabbos. So since he's liable to the death penalty, he's not also liable to the smaller included penalty principle we've seen often. One who performs a single act for which he is liable to receive the death penalty and is also liable to pay money for the same exact action receives only the death penalty. And similarly, one who pours another's wine as a libation for idol worship incurs the death penalty for performing idolatry and is therefore exempt from paying for the wine. And ultimately, they held that the liabilities are not incurred simultaneously in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Yirmiyah. As Rabbi Yirmiyah says, from the time of the lifting, the thief acquires the wine and is therefore immediately liable to pay money to the owner. He became liable to compensate the owner as soon as he lifted the wine, but he didn't become liable to the death penalty for committing avodah zarah, idolatry, until he actually poured the libation for the idol. So once the sages concluded that the liabilities are not incurred simultaneously, they ruled that one who pours another's wine as a libation for idol worship is liable to reimburse him. And that's good because the death penalty would almost never apply, and probably never, right? Because they actually imposed the death penalty. The person has to be warned. If you perform avodah zarah, you will be liable to the death penalty, and the warning is given in front of witnesses, and then the person immediately performs the act also in front of witnesses, and then all of the witnesses and the defendant come before a rabbinic court with the authority to impose a death penalty, which is already super rare, and then that they would somehow vote to do it, and they wouldn't find some extenuating circumstance to avoid imposing the death penalty, which they would always do. So the death penalty is never going to actually happen. But as we've seen before, if one is subject to the death penalty, even if it is not imposed by the court, he's actually going to skate on a financial liability if the financial liability and the death penalty would arise from the very same action. So once you split the actions, that he became liable for the financial liability before he became liable for the death penalty, then even though he's not going to have the death penalty imposed on him, he will have to pay for the wine that he ruined. In other words, made it prohibited for benefit by any Jew, whence he used it in avodah zarah, in idolatry. Now, the Gemara returns to the matter of one who showed another person's field to thugs. Now, Rav Huna bar Yehuda happened to come to the town of Be'abione, and he came before Rava, who said to him, "Did any legal incident come to you for judgment recently?" And Rav Huna bar Yehuda said to him, "Well, there was a case of a Jew whom Gentiles coerced. And as a result, he showed them property belonging to his fellow Jew, which the Gentiles later came back and seized. And he came to me for judgment, and I deemed him liable to compensate the owner for the loss." Right, so the Jew who, showed the Gentiles what land they could seize, he was obviously a pious person because he came for judgment, right? It doesn't sound like the one whose land was taken is the one who came for judgment. Rava said to Rav Huna bar Yehuda, "Reverse your decision in this case and return the money to its owner," meaning the thugs, what they took, and the one who showed them what land to take won't be liable. As it is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of a Jew whom Gentiles coerced, meaning under threat of death or something very serious, they forced him to show his neighbor's land. That's different than one who was a willing collaborator, capo, etc. And as a result, he showed them property belonging to another that the Gentiles later seized. He is exempt from reimbursing the owner of the property. But if he actively took the property and gave it to the Gentiles by his own hand, then he would be liable to compensate the owner. Now the Gemara adds that Rabbah says, if he showed the Gentiles the property of his own volition, it is as though he actively took the property and gave it to the Gentiles by his own hand, and he is liable to compensate the owner. The Gemara recounts another incident. There was a certain man that Gentiles had coerced, and so he showed them the wine of Rav Mari, the son of Rav Pinchas, the son of Rav Chizda. And the Gentiles said to him, "Carry the wine and bring it with us." He complied with the Gentiles, and so he carried and brought the wine with them. The case came before Rav Ashi, and he exempted the man from compensating Rav Mari for the wine. So the rabbi said to Rav Ashi, "But isn't it taught in a Baraisa, if he took the property and manually, by his own hand, transferred it to the Gentiles, he is liable to compensate the owner?" Rav Ashi said to them, "That statement applies only in a case where the Jew did not bring the Gentiles to the property at the outset. But if he brought the Gentiles to the property at the outset, then it is as though he already burned it, as the Gentiles then had access to the property. Since the damage inflicted by the Jew was committed by merely showing the wine to the Gentiles, he's exempt from payment, even though he later actively carried the wine with his hands." Rabbi Abahu raised an objection to the opinion of Rav Ashi from a Baraisa. In a case where a ruffian said to a Jew, "Pass me this bundle of grain or this cluster of grapes," and the Jew passed it to him, the Jew is liable to pay the owner of the grain or the grapes. Since the ruffian was already present, it is evident from this Baraisa that one who hands over the property of a third party is liable despite the fact that the latter already had access to it. And Rav Ashi answered, with what are we dealing here? We are dealing with a case where the Jew and the ruffian were standing on two different sides of a river, so that the ruffian did not have access to the item until the Jew passed it to him. And the Gemara points out that the language of the Baraisa is also precise according to this explanation, as it teaches its ruling using the term pass, which indicates that the ruffian could not have reached the item himself. And it did not teach the Baraisa using the term give, which would indicate that the ruffian was standing next to the other individual. And the Gemara concludes, learn from the language of the Baraisa that Rav Ashi's interpretation is correct. Now, before we read another incident, this is how the law ended up being formulated. If the king decreed, now this is a Gentile king, right? So Jews in diaspora. If the king decreed that wine or straw be brought to him, and the Jew informed the authorities that another Jew had stores of these commodities in a particular location, and these stores were then confiscated, the informant is liable to reimburse the victim. If the informant was coerced into doing so under threat of death or torture, then he is exempt. But if he was threatened with monetary loss, he is liable. Others hold that even financial extortion suffices to render him exempt, but that is nevertheless prohibited to provide. But that it is nevertheless prohibited to provide the information ab initio. Don't be an informer. Don't be a collaborator. If one personally handed over the property of another Jew to Gentiles, he is liable to pay compensation even if he was coerced. Don't be a willing participant, right, when these thugs seize your neighbor's property. And some hold that even in this case he is exempt. And the obligation to pay if one personally hands over the property to the Gentiles applies only if they could not have seized the property themselves. If they could have seized it themselves, even if they weren't able to do so by the informant, and they coerced the informant to carry the goods to another location, then the informant is exempt. Now you can see there's a lot of nuance to this law, but you can really get that picture. Jews have been around for a long time, right? For thousands of years. And we've always been a very minority community that is, has often provided tremendous benefit to our hosts. And that's why we're always initially invited into a country. And then Jews tend to succeed in those countries. And then, most people are fine with the Jews. And a few Jew haters will arise and say, look at them. They're so successful. It must be that they're ripping us off. Let's take their stuff. And then they'll, get a mob together who will come and seize the property of the Jews. And when it gets bad enough, when the pogroms get bad enough, the Jews move on to some other place. And that's been a repeating cycle for thousands of years. And that's why we've been longing for our own country for so long. And what a miracle to live in an age when we have finally our own country in Israel. And now, there's pogroms and people trying to throw us out of that land. And, we're not going. And you can see why. Another incident. There was a certain fishing net over which two people were quarreling. And this one said, it is mine. And that one said, it is mine. And one of them went and gave it to an officer of the king. And Abaye said, he is exempt from payment because he can say to the court, when I gave it to the official, I gave what is mine. And Rava said to Abaye, and is it in his power to do so when the ownership of the net is subject to a dispute? Rather, Rava said, we excommunicate him until he brings the net back and stands in court to adjudicate the initial dispute of who actually owns the net. And the Gemara relates another incident. There was a certain man who desired to show another individual's straw to the Gentile authorities who would seize it. And he came before Rav, who said to him, do not show it and do not show it, i.e., you are absolutely prohibited from showing it. And the man said to him, I will show it and I will show it. I will certainly show it. Rav Kahana was sitting before Rav, and hearing the man's disrespectful response, he dislodged the man's neck from him, i.e., Rav Kahana broke the man's neck and killed him. So, few rabbinic courts, since the Sanhedrin was meeting in Jerusalem, right, when the Jews initially had sovereignty over the land, have actually had the power to impose death sentences. However, there have been many times in history, listen to this, Rav Kahana was justified in killing this individual because a Jew who serves as an informer against other Jews to the Gentile authorities is deserving of death. And this is due to the fact that in addition to causing monetary harm to individuals, he also endangers the safety of the entire Jewish community. And consequently, he has the halakhic status of one who pursues another with the intent to kill him. He is a mortal threat to the community, and the community can rise up and kill him. And this is the law even when there is no longer a rabbinical court that has the authority to impose capital punishment. Historically, this extra-legal, right, non-legal, this extra-legal capital punishment was put into practice in many Jewish communities over the course of the generations when they felt they were pushed to such an extreme. Now, this is a long daf, and so we don't have time for me to tell a long side story. but you've heard me tell this story before about a journey of the Sovrunner Rebbe, who had to stop for Shabbos in a town unexpectedly, and the residents of that town treated him with great honor. And then by the third meal on Shabbos, they said to him, it's no accident that you were sent here. This story is happening in the 1800s. It's no accident that God sent you here, that you unexpectedly spent Shabbos with us because of these freak rainstorms, because we have a very serious problem here. And what we have is a Jew who is an informer. He's a drunk. And to get his vodka money and to just, whatever, he sells out families who are hiding their sons from conscription into the Tsar's army. Now you have to understand that in those days, conscription into the army of the Tsar was not a 3-year hitch or a 4-year hitch or a 5-year hitch. It was a 25-year hitch, and it was the end of a Jew's life as a Jew. There's no way you could eat kosher. There's no way you could be Sabbath observant. There's no way that you would probably even survive those 25 years, because the army was quite cruel to these types of Jews that were conscripted, unless they themselves became a mortal enemy of the Jews, helping the Tsar's army conduct pogroms against the Jews. So it's a terrible, terrible fate for that. And that's why families hid their sons from these Cossack armies when they were looking for conscripts. And this informer, telling the army where to find these Jews was a mortal peril to that community. So they said to the Sovrunner Rebbe, we've got 2 rabbis in this town, and they are ready to sign off on executing this informer. But they're 2, remote, rural, small-time rabbis. You are a big, prominent rabbi, a great Rebbe. And so if you could come together with the other 2 rabbis and, pass sentence on this informer, then we'll get rid of him. The Sovrunner Rebbe had his own agenda, which is part of the story I could tell another time. But he agreed to join in that Beis Din and render that informer liable to the death penalty. And after Shabbos ended, they fired up the mikvah, right, the communal bath, and it was heated, right, and so they fired up the furnace under the mikvah. They went and got that informer and said, Sovrunner Rebbe would like to meet you. Hey, what does he want me for? Oh, I don't know, you should come. And he came, and as they walked past the mikvah, they seized him by the arms and threw him into the fiery furnace. Now, that's not something that happened often, but as you just read in this note from Rav Steinsaltz, it happened from time to time when informer was endangering, a huge swath of the Jewish world with, stuff like this. So there you go. They don't smile kindly on informers who turn people in. Now, another incident. Where was I? So the Gemara relates another incident. I'm sorry. So Rav Kahana killed this informer, right, who was disrespecting Rav. Now, seeing Rav Kahana's action, Rav read the following verse about him. Your sons have fainted. They lie at the head of all the streets as an antelope in a net. Isaiah 51:20. Now, just as with regard to this antelope, once it falls into the net, the hunter does not have mercy upon him. So too, with regard to the money of a Jew, once it falls into the hand of Gentiles, they do not have mercy upon him, i.e. the Jew. Since the Gentiles who seek a Jew's money will kill him in order to seize the property, Rav Kahana acted appropriately when he broke the miscreant's neck, as he protected the Jew's property and by extension, the Jew's life. Rav then said to Rav Kahana, so, Kahana, you did the right thing, morally, but strategically, politically? Kahana, until now, there were Persian rulers who were not particular about bloodshed. Right? The Persians let us deal with our community how we see fit. But now there are Greeks who are particular about bloodshed. The Greeks don't let us take care of our own problems. They will get involved. And they will say, murder, right? You killed this man. They will say it was murder. and they will press charges against you. Therefore, says Rav to Rav Kahana, get up and ascend to Eretz Yisrael, right? Leave Bava in Persia, which is now part of the Greek Empire, and go up to Eretz Yisrael, where they don't know you. And, where the local Greeks don't know you. Right? Is this Greek at this time, or is it Roman? I thought it was Roman, but okay. So maybe there were Greeks in this part of Persia, but the Romans are in the Holy Land. And he says, murder, and they will press charges against you. Therefore, get up and ascend to Eretz Yisrael and study there under Rabbi Yochanan, and accept upon yourself that you will not raise any difficulties to the statements of Rabbi Yochanan for 7 years. In other words, Rav Kahana is very argumentative, hot-blooded, as you can see from what he did, temperamental type of guy. And they know him here in Bava, and he's risen to prominence, but now he's going to start over in exile, as it were, although exile back to the Holy Land, with the community of sages over there, led by Rabbi Yochanan, right? And so what Rav is saying to Rav Kahana is, when you go, start over again in that community of sages, be meek, keep your mouth shut, don't challenge Rabbi Yochanan and make a pest of yourself, at least for 7 years, right? So Rav Kahana went to Eretz Yisrael, and he found Reish Lakish, right? Reish Lakish was initially the student of Rabbi Yochanan, and later his colleague, because he was of such a great, great mind and stature. So Rav Kahana went and he found Reish Lakish, who was sitting and reviewing Rabbi Yochanan's daily lecture in the academy for the rabbis, i.e. the students in the academy. So when Reish Lakish finished, Rav Kahana said to the students, where is Reish Lakish? And they said to him, why do you wish to see him? And Rav Kahana said to them, well, I have this difficulty and that difficulty with his review of Rabbi Yochanan's lecture, and this resolution and that resolution to the questions that he raised. So they told this to Reish Lakish. Reish Lakish then went and said to Rabbi Yochanan, a lion has ascended from Babylonia. In other words, Reish Lakish immediately recognized that this guy who came up from Bava is a genius, and a pushy type of genius, who was able to immediately on his first day here find all kinds of difficulties with the discourse that Reish Lakish was repeating on behalf of Rabbi Yochanan. So it's Rabbi Yochanan's teachings that Rav Kahana was challenging, but he heard them from Reish Lakish. A lion has ascended from Bava, and the master, meaning Rabbi Yochanan, ought to examine the discourse he will deliver in the academy tomorrow, as Rav Kahana may raise difficult questions about the material. So the next day, they seated Rav Kahana in the first row, in front of, directly in front of Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan stated a halacha, a law, and Rav Kahana did not raise a difficulty in accordance with Rav's instruction, who said, don't challenge Rabbi Yochanan. Rabbi Yochanan stated another halacha, and again, Rav Kahana did not raise a difficulty. And as a result, they placed Rav Kahana further back by 1 row. And this occurred until he had been moved back 7 rows, until he was seated in the last row. Well, we thought this guy was really clever, but actually, he's not challenging Rabbi Yochanan at all. Rabbi Yochanan might even be purposely seeding some mistakes into his lecture to test this Rav Kahana, but Rav Kahana keeps his mouth shut. So apparently he's not such a lion, and they moved him to the back. After the lecture, Rabbi Yochanan said to Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, meaning Reish Lakish, the lion that you mentioned has become a fox, meaning silent and not knowledgeable. Rav Kahana said to himself, maybe it is God's will that these 7 rows that I have been moved should replace the 7 years that Rav told me to wait before raising difficulties to the statements of Rabbi Yochanan. Rav Kahana really had trouble keeping his mouth shut. Now that they moved him back 7 rows, which was embarrassing to him for sure, he's like, well, I am a great sage. I've been humiliated. Maybe these 7 rows I've been moved back will take the place of the 7 years I was supposed to keep my mouth shut. So he stood up on his feet, and he said to Rabbi Yochanan, let the master go back to the beginning of the discourse and repeat what he said. Rabbi Yochanan stated a halacha, and Rav Kahana raised a difficulty. Therefore, they placed him in the first row. And again, Rav Yochanan stated a halacha, and Rav Kahana raised a difficulty. Now, Rabbi Yochanan was sitting upon 7 cushions so that he could be seen by all the students. And since he could not answer Rav Kahana's challenges, he removed one cushion from under himself to demonstrate that he was lowering himself out of respect for Rav Kahana. And he then stated another halacha, and Rav Kahana raised another difficulty. And this happened repeatedly until Rabbi Yochanan had removed all the cushions from underneath himself, and he was sitting on the ground. Right? Rabbi Yochanan was a very humble man. When he realized that he had this lion from Bava in front of him, this genius, who kept challenging him and that he couldn't respond in kind, he said, wow, he might be younger than me. He might be the new guy. We might not know him so well. But all that matters is the Torah. And this guy's Torah is top notch. And I will humble myself before him. Kind of something like Moses would do, right? The humblest person who ever lived. Rabbi Yochanan was an old man. And his eyebrows drooped over his eyes, so he couldn't see very clearly. And he said to his students, uncover my eyes for me. I want to see this Rav Kahana. So they uncovered his eyes for him with a silver eye brush. Like his eyelashes were so heavy they actually had to comb them back, because for the first time he wanted to see super clearly. Once his eyes were uncovered, Rabbi Yochanan saw that Rav Kahana's lips were split, like his mouth was open in a way that he didn't understand the expression on Kahana's face. And Rabbi Yochanan thought that Rav Kahana was smirking at him. The great Rabbi Yochanan, he can't stand up to my challenges. And it's as if Rav Kahana is being insolent. As a result, Rabbi Yochanan was offended. You don't offend Rabbi Yochanan. And without further ado, the Gemara says, as a result, Rabbi Yochanan was offended and Rav Kahana died as punishment for the fact that he offended Rabbi Yochanan. Right? The great sages, if they looked at you with anger, like the curse of their eyes was enough to kill. The next day, Rabbi Yochanan said to the rabbis, his students, did you see how that Babylonian, Rav Kahana, behaved in such a disrespectful manner? They said to him, his unusual manner of appearance is like that. He was not mocking you. That's just the way he holds his mouth. There was no mockery involved. Hearing this, Rabbi Yochanan went up to Rav Kahana's burial cave, and he saw that it was encircled by an achna, a serpent, which had placed its tail in its mouth, completely encircling the cave and blocking the entrance. Now we're on 117b. Rabbi Yochanan said to the serpent, serpent, open your mouth and allow the teacher to enter and be near the disciple. But the serpent did not open its mouth to allow him entry. So then Rabbi Yochanan said, allow a colleague to enter and be near his colleague. But still the serpent did not open its mouth. Rabbi Yochanan said, allow the disciple to enter and be near the teacher. Rabbi Yochanan is humbling himself again. He's saying, I'm the disciple, Kahana is the teacher. The snake then opened its mouth for him to allow him entry. And Rabbi Yochanan requested divine mercy from God, and he raised Rav Kahana from the dead. Remember the story, Rabbi and Rabbi and Rabbi Zera at Purim. Purim is approaching. Similar idea. Rabbi arose and slew Rabbi Zera, and the next day prayed for mercy on his behalf and resurrected him. So here we have Rabbi Yochanan cursing and killing Rav Kahana and then praying for divine mercy and resurrecting him. Rabbi Yochanan said to Rav Kahana, had I known that this was the master's manner of appearance, I would not have been offended. Now let the master come with me to the study hall. Rav Kahana said to him, if you are able to request divine mercy so that I will not die again, I will go with you. And if not, I will not go with you. And the Gemara comments, since the time decreed for his death had passed, it had passed. Right? Rav Kahana was afraid, did you just resurrect me for a moment to apologize, or am I really resurrected? Answer, resurrected. Rabbi Yochanan then completely awakened him and stood him up. And thereafter he asked him about every uncertainty that he had, and Rav Kahana resolved each of them for him. And this is the background to that which Rabbi Yochanan says to his students on several occasions. What I said was yours is in fact theirs. I.e., I thought that the Torah scholars in Eretz Yisrael were the most advanced, but in fact the scholars in Bavel are the most advanced, as evidenced by Rav Kahana's knowledge. Good to hear, since we're studying the Babylonian Talmud compiled by the Jewish community in Bava. Now, the Gemara relates another incident pertaining to one who informed Gentiles of the whereabouts of another Jew's property. There was a certain individual who showed Rabbi Abba's silk to Gentiles, and they seized it. Rabbi Bahu and Rabbi Chanina Bar Papi and Rabbi Yitzhak Napacha sat together to determine whether Rabbi Abba was entitled to compensation from the informer, and Rabbi Ilya sat next to them. The judges thought to deem the informer liable to reimburse Rabbi Abba based upon that which we learned in a Mishna, Bechoros 28b. If a judge issued a judgment and he made a mistake, and he acquitted one who was in fact liable, or he deemed liable one who should have been acquitted, or if he ruled that a pure item is impure, or he ruled that an impure item is pure, and by doing so he caused a litigant a monetary loss, well, what he did is done, i.e. the judgment stands. And the judge must pay damages from his home, i.e. from his personal funds. And this indicates that one is liable to pay for financial loss that he causes, even if his involvement was only through speech. Imagine if our judges, if they judged falsely, if they judged in, blatant error, they would have to compensate the defendant for whatever loss the judgment had cost him. Judges would be a little different then. Rabbi Ilya said to them, this is what Rav says, and that Mishnah is discussing a case where the judge not only issued a ruling, but actively took the money from the one he found liable, and he gave it to the other party by his own hand. Consequently, it cannot serve as a precedent to render the informer liable in this case, who only spoke. And the sages serving as judges said to Rabbi Abba, go to Rabbi Shimon ben Eliakim and Rabbi Elazar ben Pedat, who rule that there is liability for damage caused by indirect action. Rabbi Abba went to them, and they deemed the informer liable to reimburse Rabbi Abba, as it is taught in the Mishnah, if the thugs seized the field due to the robber, meaning they stole it from the robber, not from the whole region, then he is liable to provide the owner with a different field. And it was established that the Mishnah is referring to a case where an individual showed the field to thugs who later seized it. And the law stated in the Mishnah would apply to this case as well. And the Gemara relates another incident. There was a certain man with whom a silver cup was deposited, and thieves came upon him in his home, and he took the cup and gave it to them. So the case came before Rabbah, and Rabbah exempted him from payment. Abaye said to him, this individual is saving himself with another person's property, and he should therefore be liable. Rather, Rav Ashi said in explanation of Rabbah's ruling, we look at his financial status. If the Baili, the one who is charged with storing the item, is a wealthy man, well, then the thieves came with the intent to steal his property, and he is therefore liable to pay, as he saved himself from financial loss by handing over another person's property. But if he is not wealthy, then the thieves presumably came with the intent to steal the silver cup itself, and he is therefore exempt from liability. And the Gemara relates another incident. There was a certain man with whom the purse containing funds collected for the redemption of captives was deposited. And thieves came upon him, and he took the purse and gave it to them. And the case came before Rabbah, and Rabbah exempted him from payment. And Abaye said to him, but this individual is saving himself with another person's property. In this case, the funds that had been collected to redeem captives who had been taken by the Gentiles and were languishing in prison. So Abaye, he's saving himself with another person's property, and he should therefore be liable to pay. Rabbah said to Abaye, you have no greater redemption of captives than this, since the man used the money to avoid being harmed by the thieves. And Rabbah considered the money to have been used for its intended purpose. That's how he ruled. The Gemara relates a different incident. There was a certain man who hastened and brought his donkey on board a ferry before other people boarded the ferry. And the donkey began to move around and was about to cause the boat to sink. a certain other man came and pushed the donkey of the first man into the river, and the donkey drowned. And the case came before Rabba, and Rabba exempted him from payment. And Abaye said to him, but this individual is saving himself with another person's property, so he should be liable to pay. And Rabba said to him, the owner of the donkey was considered a pursuer from the outset, as he endangered the other travelers, and it is permitted to stop a pursuer by any means necessary, including destroying his property. And the Gemara notes that Rabbah conforms to a standard line of reasoning, as Rabbah says, in the case of a pursuer who was chasing after another in order to kill him, and the pursuer broke vessels during the chase, whether they belong to the pursued party or to anyone else, he is exempt from reimbursing the owner of the vessels. And this is because he is liable to receive the death penalty for attempted murder and is consequently exempt from any monetary liability he incurs simultaneously. And a pursued individual who broke the vessels of the pursuer is also exempt from payment, as the pursuer's property shall not be cherished more than his body, i.e. his life. Since it is permitted to kill the pursuer in order to save his intended victim, it is permitted to destroy his property for the same purpose. But if he destroyed property belonging to anyone else, if the one being pursued, right, destroyed, if bad guys are trying to kill you and you carjack somebody's car in order to escape, okay, it was permitted to do that to save your life, but the person whose car you took, if you destroyed that car in the ensuing chase, you owe them the cost of that car because you used that car to save your life. You took it from an innocent third-party bystander. And with regard, and that is worded like this, but if he destroyed property belonging to anyone else, he is liable to reimburse them, as it is prohibited for him to save himself with another person's property, meaning it's permitted, but he has to reimburse them. And with regard to a pursuer who is chasing after another pursuer in order to save the latter pursuer's intended victim, and this pursuer broke vessels during the chase, whether they belong to the pursued individual, i.e. the individual attempting murder, or to anyone else, he is exempt from payment. And the Gemara notes, and this is not the law by Torah law, but if you do not say so, you will not have any person that saves another from a pursuer, right? So if you see a killer trying to kill someone else, and you're going to step in and save the intended victim, and you harm some third party's, property in the process, you're not going to be liable to reimburse them. Maybe the victim who was saved from being killed by your intervention, maybe he should make good to the person whose property was damaged, in the process of saving that intended victim. But the one who steps in just to, be a hero and save the day, he's not going to have to reimburse people for property that gets destroyed in the course of saving the intended victim from the murderer. And maybe the murderer should have to pay, or the intended murderer. That's a different story. Now, and that concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 6. We're just going to read Mishnah number 7, which is short, because tomorrow's daf is quite long too. So we're going to keep going. So Mishnah number 7, if a river flooded a misappropriated field, a field that had been stolen, the robber may say to its owner, that which is yours is before you, and no compensation is required. Since the field would have been flooded in any case, the fact that the robber stole it and now is giving it back, he didn't cause it to become flooded, so the fact that it was damaged is not actually the robber's responsibility. That's the Mishnah. The Gemara. The sages taught, in the case of one who robbed a field from another and a river then flooded it, the robber is liable to provide the field's owner with a different field. Well, this is the statement of Rabbi Elazar, the minority opinion. And the rabbis say he is exempt from doing so, as he can say to the owner, that which is yours is before you. Now, the Gemara analyzes this dispute between Rabbi Elazar and the majority. With regard to what do they disagree? And the Gemara explains, Rabbi Elazar interpreted the verses, quote, if anyone sin and commit a trespass against the Lord and deal falsely with his neighbor in a matter of deposit or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full. Leviticus 5:21-24. According to the exegetical principle of amplifications and restrictions. So the phrase, if anyone sin and commit a trespass against the Lord and deal falsely with his neighbor, this is an amplification. And when the verse states in a matter of deposit, it has restricted the law to the case of a deposit. And when the verse then states, or anything about which he has sworn falsely, he shall restore it in full, now it has amplified again. Accordingly, as the Torah amplified and then restricted and then amplified again, it has amplified the law to include everything with only a single exception. And what is included due to the fact that the verse amplified the law? The verse has amplified the law to include everything that one steals. And what is excluded due to the fact that the verse restricted the law? It restricted the law in order to exclude financial documents, which are dissimilar to a deposit in that their value is not intrinsic, but rather due to their function. The paper's not worth anything. It's the agreement that is written therein. And consequently, according to Rabbi Lazar, land that was stolen is included in the laws stated in these verses, and one who steals land must reimburse the field's owner, even if a flood came later. And then he says, well, take that which is yours. But the rabbis interpreted these verses according to the different exegetical principle of generalizations and details. So the phrase, and deal falsely with his neighbor, this is a generalization, while the subsequent phrase, in a matter of deposit, this is a detail. And when the verse then states, or anything about which he has sworn falsely shall restore it in full, it has generalized again. So it's a case of generalization, detail, generalization. And from this you may deduce that the verse is referring only to items that are similar to the detail. Accordingly, just as the detail, i.e. a deposit, is movable property and has intrinsic monetary value, so too the verse includes anything that has movable property and has intrinsic monetary value. Consequently, land has been excluded as it is not movable property. Slaves have been excluded as they are compared to land with regard to many areas of halacha. Financial documents have been excluded because, although they are movable property, they do not have intrinsic monetary value. And the Gemara asks, and there is that which is taught in a Baraisa, in the case of one who robbed another of a cow and the river washed away the cow, the robber is liable to provide the owner with another cow. This is the statement of Rabbi Lazar. And the rabbis say the robber can say to the owner, that which is yours is before you, and he would consequently be exempt when he returns the drowned cow. And the Gemara asks there in the Baraisa with regard to what do they disagree? The rationale offered previously cannot apply, as a cow is movable property and it has intrinsic value, and yet Rabbi Lazar and the rabbis still disagree. So Rav Papa said, and I'm very close to done, questions or comments, please get them in now. Rav Papa said there, with what are we dealing? We are dealing with a case where he had robbed another of a field, and there was a prone cow in it, and a river washed it away. So Rabbi Lazar conforms to a standard line of reasoning, as he maintains that land is included in the category of items that are not subject to the laws of robbery. Consequently, the robber acquires the land and simultaneously becomes liable to return it. Since he acquires the land, he acquires the cow that is on the land as well, and is liable to compensate its owner when it gets washed away by the river. And the rabbis conform to their standard line of reasoning, as they hold that the land was excluded by the verse. Therefore, the robber does not acquire the land, and he does not acquire the cow. That concludes our discussion of Mishnah number 7. That was a short Mishnah, a short Gemara. So tomorrow we'll pick it up with page 118, the penultimate page in Tractate Bava Kamma, God willing. Okay, so this is a colorful page. Bill. It is probably Greeks. Remember, when the Western Roman Empire fell, the Eastern Empire, based in Greece, lasted for another 1,000 years. Thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Bell Plumber, who knew snitches get stitches was Talmudic. Very good. And Joseph says, what is a takana? So takana is a type of rabbinic decree, like we talked about the takanas hashuk. Right? A decree that's something that you purchased in the marketplace. If it turns out to be stolen later, the one who sells it to you needs to reimburse you. So it's a rabbinic decree, right? And there are different kinds of rabbinic decrees, a gezerah, takana. We don't have to get into the nuances of what is their differences. The point is that the sages decree, and that is the law. Ilanit says, Daf 117 is huge. Great story about the resurrection of Rav Kahana by Rabbi Yochanan. Always wondered why were eyebrows that impede sight so dramatically not just trimmed? Great question. I don't know the answer. But you almost get that feeling that, if you ever watched, The Lord of the Rings, right? And there was the King of Gondor, and, he had that worm tongue, literally called worm tongue, with a worm tongue in his ear, telling him evil things. And he just kind of got lower and lower and older. And, he just got old before his time. And, he was kind of unkempt. And then, when the heroes came and said, "Awake!" and Gandalf says, "Awake, King of Gondor," right? And he sort of came back to himself and he was rejuvenated. And it's almost like maybe Rav Kahana rejuvenated Rabbi Yochanan in that way. I mean, he had Reish Lakish to challenge him. But, Rabbi Yochanan had become old and, maybe was just so ensconced as the Gadol, right, the greatest sage of the generation in that locale. He just hadn't really been challenged, and certainly not publicly. And so maybe ultimately, and he said so, right, that Rav Kahana's challenges were good for him, and it kind of awakened him. And maybe the sort of long eyebrows are a little bit of... it happened, but it's also kind of a visual metaphor for that, more internal, dramatic, emotional rising. That's what I've got for us today. And with God's help, we'll be together again tomorrow, Wednesday, for Daf 118. 119, the final daf of this tractate. On Thursday, we'll make a siyum, bring, a little l'chaim, so that we can make a toast together to finishing this tractate on that day, God willing. All the best.